You are a true nerd. Gamer nerds shouldn't review metal albums. Sounds like nerd propaganda to me.
Shut up! Please and thank you. Good morning, metalheads of the internet, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Metal Meltdown. Guess what? All metalheads are nerds. All of them. Every single one of them. That includes you, and that especially includes you. You might think you're not a nerd. You might tell yourself that you're not a nerd. But you are. And that's fine. I don't mean this as an insult. I apologize if it sounds like an insult, but I promise you it's not meant to be an insult. I am simply reminding you. I'm just letting you know. It's a matter of fact that all metalheads, including you, and including me, we're all nerds, and it's time to accept that. Why are we here? What's going on? Why have you reminded me of the fact that I'm a nerd? Also, I'm not a nerd. I'm not a nerd. You are, and that's okay. I'm gonna tell you why we're here and why we're doing this. Whenever metalheads get mad online, and I have found specifically when they get mad at me for just kind of existing, for just making videos and having fun and talking about music, they always resort to like a very specific list of like insults and names. And it's a very small list, but a very specific list nonetheless. For instance, I've been called a poser and an elitist so many times that both of those words almost have no meaning to me anymore. I've also been told over and over and over again that I'm gay, that I'm a liberal, that I'm a millennial, that I'm a snowflake. I'm sometimes called all of these things all at once, and I just kind of chuckle and chortle and roll my eyes at this point when I see shit like that. But the one that I think is the most full-blown, silly and goofy and stupid is nerd. Because I have yet to meet a metalhead, offline or online, that isn't a total nerd. Like, a metalhead using nerd as an insult is truly the equivalent to the pot calling the kettle black. I have yet to meet a metalhead that isn't super into sci-fi and fantasy literature, horror movies, comic books, video games, anime, stupid cartoons, or world history, or some kind of specific culture or religion or mythology. People who identify as metalheads and people who identify as nerds share several similarities in their interests and hobbies. And I found this great comment from Captain Carbon on Reddit, which I think really explains like why I'm talking the way I'm talking and why I'm feeling the way I'm feeling. There are similarities with obsessive hobbies which are generally considered niche and not understood by a larger demographic. Both nerds, geeks, and metalheads, for lack of a better word, have a shared interest in science fiction, fantasy, imaginative narratives, and what seems like a complex structure to their interests. Even without that, you have both groups who are set apart against larger social grouping by their specialized interests. The only thing which separates geeks from sports fanatics is the cultural understanding of the latter, where one activity is a pastime while the other is a waste of time. Too long didn't read. Both groups own dragon posters, masturbate to elves, and play D&D in basements. Bravo! Nailed it. I could unironically end the video here. Captain Carbon actually kind of seriously nailed it. But we're not gonna end the video here. We're gonna keep going. And keep in mind, that's just the bare minimum argument. I'm going to go even further. I'm going to tell you that metal is inherently nerdy. It always has been. It always will be. Don't believe me? Let's talk about Iron Maiden, one of the most influential, iconic, and successful metal bands of all time. Without them, metal music itself looks and sounds a lot different. Guess what? They're huge fucking nerds. To be more specific, they're history, mythology, and literature nerds. For example, the album Peace of Mind lyrically largely reflects the group's literary interests, such as To Tame a Land, inspired by Frank Herbert's 1965 science fiction novel Dune. Sun and Steel, based on the life of samurai Miyamoto Musashi and its title taken from Yukio Mishima's 1968 essay. Still Life, influenced by Ramsey Campbell's 1964 short story The Inhabitant of the Lake, and The Trooper, inspired by Alfred Lord Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade. There's also a lot of influence from Greek mythology and even movies of the time, a great example of the former being The Flight of Icarus, a great example of the latter being Where Eagles Dare and Quest for Fire, named after movies of the same name released in 1968 and 1981 respectively. And then there's Power Slave, which kind of has this ancient Egyptian theme for the album cover and also contains a complete musical retelling of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Also, Somewhere in Time, which is a synth-driven heavy metal, prog metal concept album of sorts set in a dystopian futuristic world. And look at that, boom, another synth-driven heavy metal, prog metal concept album of sorts, Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, pulling heavy influence from English folklore. I don't know, man, that all sounds kind of nerdy to me. That all sounds kind of nerdy. And Iron Maiden is hardly the only classic English metal band who were fucking nerds. Most of them were. But specifically, the founders of heavy metal itself, Black Sabbath, they were also nerds. They loved jazz music and like psychedelic and progressive rock of the time, and they also loved like old horror movies like Boris Karloff and Vincent Price and Christopher Lee stuff. In fact, the name Black Sabbath itself actually comes from the title of this Italian horror film released in 1963. And the further you go down the heavy metal music rabbit hole, honestly, the nerdier it gets. For instance, Bolt Thrower, who have a well-documented history of loving the ever-living shit out of Warhammer. There's also Niall, whose entire body of work, art, lyrics, music is heavily inspired by Egyptian mythology and culture and history. And if we're going to talk about nerdy death metal, then we really have to talk about the Black Dahlia Murder. These guys had several songs that referenced like the Castlevania games and the Evil Dead movies, and they even had their own Dungeons & Dragons styled RPG created for the previous album, Verminous, released back in 2020. And this was pretty legit. It came with a massive campaign booklet, it came with a 7-dice set, it came with maps and encounter cards and character sheets. Also, while we're on the topic, a lot of metalheads love Dungeons & Dragons. Case in point, this expansion thing sold out like in just a couple of hours. And like, I've never played like a lot of Dungeons & Dragons, but the few campaigns I've done have been in groups that were full of metalheads, and that was not done on purpose. Back in the 80s especially, there were tons of metalheads playing Dungeons & Dragons, and it's worth noting that Dungeons & Dragons also got lumped in, just like heavy metal with the whole satanic panic thing, you know? Like, the two have been intrinsically connected for years. And honestly, we could do a whole video just talking about how many bands worship the ground that horror movies and video games and literature stands on. Horror and metal also intrinsically connected. But since we're here, let's talk about a couple of highlights. I think Fulci is one of the best examples. This is an Italian death metal band that is obsessed with Italian horror movies and zombie flicks, specifically the works of Lucio Fulci. Then there's The Lion's Daughter, who blend like black metal, death metal, sludge metal, and industrial together with influence from like supernatural, abstract horror, and like creature features and body horror, and just really dark, gruesome, perverse stuff. Then there's Blut Aus Nord, a French avant-garde black metal crew that pulls a lot of influence from like existential cosmic horror, and specifically the works of H.P. Lovecraft, who in general also a massive influence on metal and like the metal aesthetic and metal lyricism. And then there's of course like the big guns, you know, like Rob Zombie, King Diamond, Cradle of Filth, Gwar, Ice Nine Kills, whose respective loves and appreciations for horror is pretty well documented, but they also all love and appreciate horror in their own unique ways. Like, Cradle of Filth takes a more operatic, romantic, vampiric kind of approach to things, like everything is drenched in a more gothic kind of horror. And then there's Gwar, who are just like really over-the-top, like extreme, gruesome, kind of comedy horror with like elements of political and social satire and comedy. And there's a ton of stuff out there too, specifically from the realms of power metal, folk metal, and symphonic metal that is obsessed not with horror, but with epic fantasy literature and cinema. You know, stuff like Game of Thrones, The Witcher, the aforementioned Dungeons & Dragons, and Warhammer, but especially The Lord of the Rings. And The Lord of the Rings in general has huge influence on metal. Focusing specifically on power metal for a moment, you have Helloween, Blind Guardian, Rhapsody of Fire, Stradivarius, Nightwish that were all pulling influence from like classic fantasy literature and cinema. Dragon Force have taken it to like the next level with their last couple of albums. They've gone into really silly, cheesy, almost overwhelmingly nerdy territory, I would say. They've written also again about Warhammer and like The Legend of Zelda, and they've done a lot of artwork and merch based on stuff like King of Fighters and Mortal Kombat. And going back specifically to Lord of the Rings, I can't think of another franchise, like another series of books or movies or whatever, that has had more of a profound impact on metal than the Lord of the fucking Rings. I mean, for God's sakes, the fucking forefathers of metal, like the pioneers of metal, the bands that laid down the foundation for metal, like fucking Led Zeppelin, for instance, hugely influential to metal music. They loved The Lord of the Rings. They were singing about Frodo and the Shire and fucking what's his name? The weird little impish figure, Gollum. They were singing about epic battles and epic adventures from all of these fucking novels and shit. Like, here's an actual section of lyrics from Ramble On. When magic filled the air, 'twas in the darkest depths of Mordor I met a girl so fair, but Gollum and the Evil One crept up and slipped away with her. There's also Misty Mountain Hop, which contains direct references to the Misty Mountains from The Hobbit. Don't forget Cirith Ungol either, pioneers of doom and power metal and epic heavy metal. They were huge Lord of the Rings nerds. In fact, the name Cirith Ungol comes from a real location in the Lord of the Rings world. The Ethelduoth defended Mordor on the west and south. The main pass was guarded by Minas Morgul, a city built by Gondor as Minas Ithil. The fortress Durthang lay in the northern Ethelduoth above Udun. A higher, more difficult pass, Cirith Ungol, lay just to the north of the Morgul Pass. Its top was guarded by a tower built by Gondor. The route traversed Terek Ungol, the lair of the giant spider Shelob. Oh yeah, well I listen to real true black metal for manly men, not for nerds. There's nothing nerdy about true cult black metal. Wrong, wrong, wrong. You too, good sir, are a nerd. Because black metal is arguably just as nerdy as power metal, if not maybe in some ways even more so. Look at Celtic Frost, for instance, pioneers of black metal. They were pulling influence from poetry and classic literature. They were using samples of the Apollo spacecraft on Into the Pandemonium. They were working closely with H.R. Geiger. Bands like Bathory and Enslaved as well were writing so much about Vikings and Viking culture and Norse mythology that kind of spawned its own subgenre of black metal music, often referred to as Viking metal. Also, speaking of Viking metal, Amon Amarth. That's nerdy as shit. That's so nerdy. I know it's not quite the same, but since we're bringing up Vikings and since we're bringing up metal, let's just briefly acknowledge Amon Amarth, also nerdy as shit. There's also Gorgoroth, Balrog, Morgoth, Isengard, all named after creatures and locations from the Lord of the Rings. Isengard also features Fenris of Darkthrone fame. And you know who else loved the Lord of the Rings? Varg Vikernes of Burzum and Mayhem fame. In fact, the word Burzum itself means darkness in the Black Speech, a fictional language crafted by the Lord of the Rings writer J.R.R. Tolkien. But wait, there's more! Did you know that the album cover for Det Som Engang Var, Burzum's sophomore studio album, is visually inspired by the advanced Dungeons & Dragons 1st edition module, The Temple of Elemental Evil? And believe it or not, Varg is such a nerd that he even wrote and designed his own mythic fantasy role-playing game entitled My Farog. Apparently this game is also, heavily inspired by Varg's, super racist and fascist beliefs, too, so, yeah, yikes. Not just a nerd, but also a pretty fucking shit one at that. And then there's, pirate metal, which is, another subgenre of metal where people get really nerdy about, pirates and nautical adventures, bands like, Ailstorm, Running Wild, Swashbuckle. And then the cherry on top of this totally bizarre fucking nerdy metal sundae, Anime Slam. This shit is so nerdy. This shit is so unbelievably fucking nerdy. with bands such as Human Instrumentality Project, Hokago Grind Time, Jig AI, Cheerleader Concubine? Ew, what the fuck? What is going on? This shit's weird. I'm not really sure I can continue scrolling through that page. There's a lot of, like, really explicit material, I would say. I'm not really interested in getting flagged. I'm not really interested in being demonetized, so we're just gonna leave that. We're gonna sidestep away from that. This is something I forgot to mention when I was filming the original video, but here's something to consider also. Metalheads are so nerdy that they just naturally, organically do nerdy shit while they're at a metal show. Like, I've seen videos of people playing Beyblade and Yu-Gi-Oh! In the mosh pit. Very recently on TikTok, I saw a video of people playing, like, Magic the Gathering at a Frozen Soul show. In conclusion, metal is for nerds. All metalheads are nerds. And most, if not all, metal bands are also nerdy and made up of people who are nerds, who are writing about the Lord of the Rings and Dune and Warhammer and fucking Game of Thrones and The Witcher and fucking Evil Dead and old horror movies and new horror movies and Resident Evil and God knows whatever the fuck else. Fucking anime, pirates, Vikings, all kinds of shit, man. Ancient Egyptian mythology, ancient Norse mythology. It's almost as if all metalheads are nerds and metal is for nerds and metal is really nerdy. It's almost as if calling a metalhead nerd is like using that as an insult. It's almost like the pot calling the kettle black. Embrace being a nerd, folks, because it's metal as fuck. Embrace your love of H.P. Lovecraft and J.R.R. Tolkien and Marvel and DC comics and video games and weird old fantasy novels and manga and whatever the fuck else. Embrace it, because it's metal, and you're a nerd, and you're a metal nerd, and you're a nerdy metalhead, and there's nothing wrong with that. And anyone using nerd as an insult, specifically metalheads using nerd as an insult in 2024, need to take a good look in the fucking mirror. That is all. I hope this has been educational, revealing, enlightening, entertaining. I don't really know. I feel like I've just kind of listed off what in theory should be obvious information, but again, there are a bunch of dumb motherfuckers who apparently aren't paying attention to the music they listen to. They just aren't. Or they're hypocrites. Or they just suck and they got nothing better to do but bitch and moan. I don't know. Whatever the case, hope you enjoyed this. Look, there's a button somewhere to subscribe. I don't know where it would be. Where would it be? Would it be over here? Let's find out. So it would be, oh, no, it would be over here. Subscribe! There'd be a video, another video up here, and another one over here. Wow, that's so crazy! Thank you for tuning in. I hope you have yourself a fantastic fucking day.